Good morning to all our listeners, and thank you to everyone for joining us for our exciting webinar today. And for those of you listening in Asia, we very much would like to extend you a good evening as well. We have a great and exciting lineup for our event today. Many of you have been watching the recent developments in the Himalayas, and we're delighted to have this event face off in the Himalayas, China's active defense and India's reaction. As many of you know, a new round of fighting at the roof of the world is nothing new to India and China. However, there was a deadly clash on June 15th between India and China in the Himalayas that is shaping up to be the worst crisis in their border quarrel since 1967. And many have a concern that that the war in the clouds may escalate to become the worst round of fighting since the 1962 Sino-Indian War, which almost brought the United States into a war with China. The COVID-19 pandemic makes the current situation even worse. It's hard to even be cool-headed in the midst of a humanitarian disaster on both sides of the disputed border. Pakistan remains a very interested player, watching the game play out just as it did in 1962, hoping its rival India will once again be humiliated. On June 15th, over 20 Indian soldiers died in the clashes in the Ladakh region adjoining Kashmir. The Chinese have not provided any casualty figures as of yet. The fighting was extremely primitive, almost medieval in the form of content and the waging of war with clubs. No firearms apparently were used, just sticks and stones. So the two armed states are now facing each other, nuclear weapons. They've had a fist fight with tremendous fatal consequences, and we're all waiting kind of to see what's going to evolve next. The remote region where the clash occurred is strategically important to both countries because it is close to where China, India, Pakistan all meet. India was badly defeated by the Chinese in 1962, losing the Aksai Chin region of Ladakh in a matter of days. Unlike in other border wars where the Chinese whipped the Indians, China did not withdraw from its gains. China today has about 15,000 square miles of territory, what has been India and Aksai Chin, and it has kept it ever since. It maintains claim to even more of Ladakh, hence we are still involved in this ongoing dispute. For decades, both sides have built up the transportation infrastructure to get troops and supplies to the Himalayan front line. A newly upgraded road built by the Indians appears to be at the center of the latest tension. We're very happy today to have this great group of speakers joining Jamestown. Our featured speaker is going to be retired Indian Colonel Ajay Shukla, who is one of India's most respected experts on Indian defense matters, strategic affairs, and international relations. Colonel Shukla is a regular writer for the Business Standard in India. He also maintains a very popular strategic affairs blog that you should be sure to check out. The title of the blog is, the name of it is actually Broadsword. The title, if you want to look it up, is ajayshukla.blogspot.com. Has thousands of readers that follow this, including one of his big fans is Dennis Blasco, who also watches and recommended this website and the blog. Colonel Shukla has become something of a media star in India and worked with New Delhi Television as a prime TV news anchor, and he's also a war correspondent. During that period working for Indian television, he's reported on ground wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, and the insurgencies in India's northeastern states and in Jammu and Kashmir. While he served in the Indian Army, Colonel Shukla served as a combat soldier for over 2 decades, retiring as a colonel after commanding a tank regiment and serving across India's borders, including in Jammu and Kashmir, Punjab, and Rajasthan. He's also a graduate of the National Defense Academy and the Indian Military Academy. Joining us today as our second speaker is Dr. Taylor Frovell. We're very delighted to have Dr. Frovell participate in our discussion. Dr. Frovell, for many of you who don't follow Indian or Chinese security affairs, you'll know that Dr. Frovell is a very prominent, well-known American expert on the Chinese military and security issues. Dr. Frovell is the Arthur and Ruth Sloan Professor of Political Science and Director of the Security Studies Program at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. In 2016, he was named as the Andrew Carnegie Fellow by the Carnegie Corporation. He serves on the board of directors of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations and is the principal investigator for the Maritime Awareness Project. He's written 2 major works. The first book that he's written is Strong Borders, Secure Nation, Cooperation, Conflict, in China's Territorial Disputes, published by Princeton Press in 2008. But Many of you may be more familiar with his most recent book that has received widespread praise and recommendations. It's the Active Defense, China's Military Strategy since 1949, published by Princeton University Press. Our third speaker is retired U.S. Army Colonel Dennis J. Blasko. So many of you follow Dennis, know that he is a prominent writer on Chinese military affairs, probably the best American expert on the Chinese military around and the PLA. Dennis is a retired U.S. Army colonel. He served for over 23 years in the U.S. Army as a military intelligence officer and foreign area officer specializing in China. Dr. Blasko serves as an Army attaché in Beijing and Hong Kong from 1992 to 96. He also served in infantry units in Germany, Italy, and Korea, and in Washington at the Defense Intelligence Agency, where he served as an infantry analyst. He is also a graduate of the United States Military Academy and the Naval Postgraduate School. He is the author of the book, The Chinese Army Today, Tradition and Transformation for the 21st Century, published by Routledge Press in 2012. And Dennis is also a regular speaker at our annual China Defense and Security Conference that Jamestown organizes each year. So we're very delighted that he's been able to participate in this online event. And many of you will know that Dennis covers the PLA, but he also covers the PLA in the Himalayas. So we're all excited to hear what he has to say. So I'll turn the floor over to Ajay Shukla, and he'll begin his discussion about sharing Indian perspectives on the face-off in the Himalayas.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Glenn. Thanks, John, for organizing this. A great honor to be on such an illustrious panel. And I've already been warned that the audience is sharp and will have lots of searching questions, and I look forward to that. Let me sort of start by giving you all a view of broadly the kind of terrain that the current crisis is playing out in. This is a view of Ladakh, the eastern tip of India's northernmost state of Jammu and Kashmir, which itself is no stranger to conflict and insurgency. Ladakh is the valley floor that you see here. It would be at a height of about anything between 11 to 12,000 feet. The mountains would go up another 4,000 to 5,000 feet above that. So they would be at 15, 16. The higher mountains would be closer to 18 or 19,000 feet. You would notice that it is a bleak, high altitude desert. There are a few trees that you see in the valley floor. But as you get out of the valley floor and the sort of rivers and rivulets that sustain those trees, you're in barren desert, high altitude desert, which makes the lack of oxygen even more worrisome because there are no trees generating oxygen over there. So the minute you get out of the valley floor, you're in high altitude terrain. I believe Glenn wants to come back to the subject later in the presentation, so I'll leave it right there. But this is the sort of terrain that we're looking at over here. In the eastern side of India, where the rest of the Sino-Indian border is located, and the bulk of the territorial dispute is sort of located, this is what it looks like. This is more like forested hills, and the eastern Himalayas that you see over there. That peak would be about 24,000 feet. So we're talking about now really rugged terrain in the eastern sector. It's all sort of a border that challenges men, equipment, weaponry, and so on. It's bleak and most difficult fighting terrain that you can imagine. And that's where the current crisis is playing out. So let me sort of start by just orienting you on a map, assuming that not too many people would be aware of the intricacies of Jammu and Kashmir. So I'll take you to a map. This is the northernmost state of Jammu and Kashmir. You'll see multiple colors over there. The red shades where it's written Gilgit-Baltistan and Azad Kashmir. Azad in inverted commas because Azad means freedom and Pakistan calls it Free Kashmir. India, of course, calls it Pakistan occupied Kashmir. So those are the areas that are claimed by India, but occupied by Pakistan. On the north in brown shade, where it's written the Shaksgam Valley, that's a part of Pakistan occupied Kashmir, used to be a part of the northern areas as they were called, until Pakistan gifted that territory to China. It has been gifted subject to the resolution of the Indian-Pakistan dispute. If it falls in India's share, China will give it up. Below that is in yellow, mustard I should say, is the Siachen Glacier, which is so bleak and so remote and so high that nobody even drew a line connecting it or allocating it to one side or the other or claiming it. And it is now in the possession of India, but claimed by Pakistan. At the point where the ochre meets the yellow representing Aksai Chin, is the Karakoram Pass, currently the northernmost tip of India. And that is the start of Ladakhi territory where the current crisis is playing out. The crisis is playing out on the border between that yellow territory of Aksai Chin, which is administered by China, claimed by India, and the line that runs is called the line of actual control, where Indian administration shades off into Chinese administration. You'll notice the yellow part is a bit like a question mark. And down below are the two dots of the question mark. That's the territory of Demchok and Chumar, which is also very heavily contested between India and China. The white portion is the part of the state, the Jammu and Kashmir state, that India actually holds and administers. It has two live borders to deal with. The border, the red part is called the line of control with Pakistan, 776 kilometers. The border on the yellow ochre shade, the Siachen Glacier, is called the actual ground position line. And the border with China on the yellow and white border, between the yellow and the white parts, is the line of actual control, as I mentioned, between India and China. So when we talk about a two-front situation for India, no place epitomizes it better than Jammu and Kashmir, because as you see over here on this map, you have those two shades, those two fronts right here. Let's go over to, now this is on the left and top, you'll see the area that we just talked about, POK, Pakistan Occupied Kashmir, Indian held Jammu and Kashmir, and the Aksai Chin there. That is the western sector of the Sino-Indian border. It has a frontage of about 1,570 kilometers. The contested area there is something in the region of 40,000 square kilometers. So we're talking about sizable chunks of territory. Then you have the central sector of the Sino-Indian dispute, two small dots over there. It's just 2,000 square kilometers. Not a big problem. If China and India can sort out the eastern and the western sector between them, the belief is that the central sector would get sorted out pretty much on its own. And then you have the eastern sector, a frontage of 1,325 kilometers. And that does not exclude Bhutan, which is an independent country. That area shaded red there where Arunachal is written, is the Indian state of Arunachal Pradesh. It's in India's possession right now, but claimed by China as South Tibet is what they call it. The border between India and China there is called the McMahon Line. It was formulated in 2014, but never accepted by China. So there you have on that slide the entire Sino-Indian dispute in one slide for you. Western sector, central sector, eastern sector. The crisis that is currently playing out is entirely confined to the western sector, to the border between Aksai Chin and the Indian state of Jammu and Kashmir. So there we are in Aksai Chin in magenta now. And now we're talking about what makes Aksai Chin so crucial to the Chinese. And that is that blue shaded line over there. That's called the Xinjiang Tibet Highway. It has a number, G219. It passes through Aksai Chin. It was built in the late 1950s, I beg your pardon. And India only found out that China was building a highway through its territory when Chinese press reports invited people for the inauguration and said that the highway is now complete. So Aksai Chin is a barren, high altitude desert. Nobody lives there. Very few people go there, but it's important to China for the simple reason that the Western Highway linking Xinjiang and Tibet goes through that territory. This is just a couple of pictures I thought I'd show you. This is the Tawang Monastery on the eastern side of the dispute. This is one of the key reasons why China wants to lay claim to Tawang specifically and the eastern sector in general as southern Tibet, because of this monastery's Buddhist influence that they worry might radiate across the border and give the Tibetans ideas. This is the mountain that we showed you over there. It's also on the western sector, the highest point on the eastern sector, I beg your pardon, called Gauri Chen Mountain. Okay, let's come to what has been happening on the frontier between Aksai Chin and India's Ladakh territory. The sort of sequence of events I'll briefly recount. On the 19th of April, intelligence reports were received on the Indian side that talked about a heavy buildup of troops and equipment on the Chinese side of the line of actual control, specifically in the Galwan area and in the area opposite Pangong Tso, which is a beautiful high altitude lake. The Indian side didn't take it very seriously. There is a sort of a degree of mobilization and a degree of activity that takes place every spring on both sides. And India normally moves a couple of brigades into the area between Leh and Galwan, where it's written on the map, to sort of exercise them also and to also serve as a countervailing presence in case China has any ideas. Now this year, India didn't move these brigades over there for exercise. The reason was the COVID pandemic. They said, it's probably not worth it. The Chinese are not going to do anything. The Chinese, of course, chose precisely this moment to do something. So on May 5th, the Galwan Valley was the first area to get occupied. This is a sort of tactically important valley for the simple reason that it provides Chinese troops access to a very strategic highway that the Indians have built. From a place called Darbuk, which I'm afraid is not on this map, but it goes along the Shyok River. The Shyok River is that very dim line that you see joining the G of Galwan. And then it goes up along that curvy line up to the Karakoram Pass to the Daulat Beg Oldi sector over there. That's India's only link with the Daulat Beg Oldi sector, its northernmost sector. And access route through Galwan allows Chinese troops to interdict this highway. The highway was completed just last year. It allows them to interdict the highway and prevent Indian troops from moving to Daulat Beg Oldi. So that was the first sign of trouble when Indian patrols were accosted by Chinese patrols in the Galwan Valley and then told that you cannot go to your customary patrolling line. Both sides go and patrol up to a line that they call their line of actual control. China believes in one line of control. India believes the line of control is further to the east. But both sides patrol up to their respective lines of control, and normally problems don't happen. But this time, the Indians found the Chinese taking control of the Galwan Valley and not allowing them to go. The next thing that happened was later in the day, the same thing happened at Hot Spring. And in May 17th, there was a major confrontation at Pangong Tso, which is the lake that you see towards the center of the slide. This was also an area where Chinese patrols stopped Indian patrols. The Chinese were in much larger numbers than the Indians, which itself was a sign of alarm. They sort of set upon the Indians. Didn't use firearms, but beat them up badly. About 70 Indians were hospitalized as a consequence. And the situation became quite evidently bad when the Chinese struck down roots there and refused to go back. In mid-May, The Chushul area also got activated by the Chinese. And then sometime in the middle of all of this, the Chinese also ingressed into Sikkim, which is in the eastern sector. They entered what is a settled international boundary between India and China. The only boundary that is settled is a 221-kilometer stretch in Sikkim. The rest of the 3,500-kilometer boundary remains unsettled, as we had shown you in those maps. But the Chinese ingressed across even settled boundary, and they are still there face to face with the Chinese in Sikkim. The Demchok buildup was also over there, and you now had a situation where the Chinese were in control of 4 or 5 points along the line of actual control. The Indians were not quite clear about what to do, so they sat down in front of the Chinese to prevent them from ingressing any further. There's a term for it. It's called mirror deployment in the sort of lexicon of the line of actual control. So the Indians are mirror deployed, but the Chinese are already in Indian territory. They're building defenses. They're connecting up roads with their own side of the line of actual control, and they seem set to stay. There were 4 distinct differences this time from the normal patrolling pattern. The first is that, as I mentioned, the Chinese were coming into areas where they had never come in before, the Galwan Valley, Sikkim, and there was sort of a degree of alarm that was caused on the Indian side because of that. The second sort of unique factor that took place was that they came in and they sat down and did not leave on multiple points. We had occasional sort of confrontations, for example, in Depsang near Daulat Beg Oldi, as you see over there on the northern tip of the map. But after a few days or after a couple of weeks, the Chinese would upstick and leave. This time they're there to stay. And the third sort of unique factor this time is the degree of violence that is being brought to bear. The Chinese are sort of not hesitating to use force, lethal force at times, and that in itself is a change. So far, we had not had lethal violence on the line of actual control since 1975, which is 45 years ago. So the incidents that are taking place now are unique for 45 years. On June 6th, commander level talks were held in Chushul between India and China, in a sort of not a very enthusiastic commitment to de-escalation and disengagement, but some sort of commitment was given by the Chinese. When the Indians went to verify that on June the 15th, you had this incident that Glenn spoke about, where the Chinese set upon the Indians, greatly outnumbering them, belaboring them with clubs and barbed wire wrapped baseball bats and what have you. 20 Indians were killed as a consequence. It really sort of took this confrontation into a different league. And now there are reports coming in of some areas being activated by the Chinese opposite Arunachal Pradesh, that is the eastern sector over there. So what has effectively happened? Let me quickly run over this before handing over to Taylor. China, in the sort of analysis of some of the analysts, has taken measures to protect the highway G219. It is providing depth to the highway. It is cutting off Depsang from where there's a good access, through the Depsang plain to the highway, which is, it has to be admitted, more than 150 kilometers away from that point. But still, it's terrain-wise, it's easier access. It's cut off the road at Galwan Valley, and it has moved and provided more depth to the highway in Hot Springs and in Pangongso. In Pangongso, it's provided visual, the PLA has provided themselves visual access to the southern bank of the lake, which they didn't have earlier. In the Indian estimation, there's probably a brigade group from the Chinese at each of these points, with 1 battalion worth of troops inside Indian territory, the rest in the rear providing reserves, and armored vehicles and artillery guns and so on, ready to deal with escalation if the Indians choose to do so. But I'll leave Dennis to talk about that. There's always been a Chinese sensitivity to infrastructure. They've always sort of been ahead of India in infrastructure building, and whenever India tries to build infrastructure, the Chinese tend to clamp down and ingress and create trouble at that point. So there is also the belief that that there could be an element of that, with India's Darbuk Shok, Daulat Beg Goldi Road causing concern to the Chinese. I think I've run out of time. I've got a lot more to say, but I'll leave it there and we can come back to the other issues that need to be discussed or that interest people who are listening at a later stage in this talk. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Ajay. That was a very detailed presentation, and I think the key to understanding this type of warfare in the Himalayas is all through maps. So, and you did a wonderful job in kind of overviewing that, the geographical challenges and problems of the situation that continues to emerge. I'm going to turn the floor over to Dr. Fravel, and Dr. Fravel is going to present the kind of the Chinese perspective about how did China kind of arrive at the situation. And Taylor, I know you're not a historian, but you are a political scientist, but please, I think your book did a wonderful job at kind of detailing kind of how did China arrive at this position, and what is it in their strategic thinking about active defense and why this region is so important to them. So Dr. Fravel, the floor is yours.
Okay, wonderful. So thank you very much for having me today. And it's a real pleasure to share this webinar with Ajay and Dennis, two individuals from whom I've learned a tremendous amount about this border and the PLA more generally. What I wanted to do is make sort of 4 points in my remarks, trying to put the China-India border today in the context of China's military strategy and how it's evolved since 1949. So the first point I want to make really has to do with how China conceives of and thinks about military strategy. And this is featured in the book that Glenn mentioned at the outset of our webinar today. And here, the main point I want to stress, right, is that China conceives of military strategies through something the PLA calls the Military Strategic Guidelines, or in Chinese, the Jinshi Zhangle Fangzhen. And these are often and almost always codified or introduced in speeches by either the head of the CMC or the ranking military member on the CMC, which is the Central Military Commission, the body in China responsible for military affairs. And basically answer 4 questions that really cut to the heart of what any military strategy would be, but answer these questions really sort of in the context of sort of China's own approach. And so the first question is basically, who will China fight in the future? Who should the strategy be focused around? This basically refers to identifying the primary strategic opponent or adversary. The second question any strategic guideline must answer is, where will China fight? Which you could think of as sort of the center of gravity for this future conflict with the primary or main strategic adversary. And in sort of the Chinese military lexicon, this is described as the primary strategic direction, or where, again, the center of gravity would be in the future war, to be distinguished from secondary strategic directions or other areas where China might fight, but that wouldn't be as important as the primary strategic direction. The third question has to do with sort of what kind of war China has to sort of prepare to fight in the future. What is sort of going to be sort of the characteristics of warfare against this main strategic opponent in this primary strategic direction. And then finally, the last question any of these strategic guidelines answers, how will China fight? Basically, what are the principles by which the force should be constructed, operations should be conducted, and so on and so forth. And so there have been 9 strategic guidelines since 1949. Which is actually a lot more than I had anticipated when I started to do my research on this topic. In part, the main reason is these guidelines aren't sort of publicly published and so, or openly published, and so it can be hard to identify them. But it's been pretty dynamic. And sort of the last feature of military strategy here that I think is important for our context is that China has viewed all of these as embodying the principle of active defense, or Jiji Fangyu in Chinese. And this principle of active defense actually goes all the way back to the early 1930s when the Communist Party's Red Army, as its military force was known then, was sort of fighting for survival in the mountainous border areas of Jiangxi and Fujian province. And we're trying to figure out how basically to sort of maintain their effective fighting strength against the much sort of stronger nationalist focus. forces. And the basic way it was defined then was sort of offensive defense, so basically a strategically defensive posture, but one that, of course, wouldn't rule out offensive operations. So in this way, it was very much contrasted with this idea of a static or a fixed defense. And this is really carried through all of these strategic guidelines from 1949 to the present. Today, the PLA defines active defense as, quote, using proactive offensive actions to defend against the attacking enemy. So there's still very much a kind of an element of striking second and not first, but of course, or of counterattacking. But here the main question is whether or not the PLA is counterattacking against an armed or kinetic attack, or if it's counteracting against some threat or challenge to what it views to be its national interest. And certainly the way in which the PLA has conceived of active defense in the last few decades has been to sort of use it to sort of rationalize or justify using military force first, perhaps, when it believes its sort of core interests have been violated. And it was sort of conceived of this way originally over Taiwan, but it perhaps might have some relevance to how we would understand the situation on the China-India border. The last thing I would say for of these 9 strategic guidelines or military strategies since 1949, the first 5 from 1956 to 1980 were premised on how to defend China in the context of a total war in which China was trying to defend against an invasion either by the United States or later the Soviet Union. Then the last 4 strategies from 1988 to the present have really been focused on how to prevail in what China defines as local wars, which would be wars on China's periphery over limited aims, primarily contested sovereignty with other states, especially Taiwan, but also, of course, the border with India. And so there really was this big sea change in China's approach to military strategy that accompanied basically the decline of the Soviet Union and ultimately the end of the Cold War. So that's my first point, really just by way of background. But now I want to move more directly to how this might relate to China and India, which brings me to my second point. Which basically is just a quick overview of strategic directions, right? You could basically sort of see China as having 4 to 5 different strategic directions. There's the northeast, which would be the areas adjacent from the Korean Peninsula. The north, sort of the areas that would either abut the Soviet Union during the Cold War, to include Mongolia. Sort of the east coast, which would especially focus on Taiwan, and then basically the south, which might include Vietnam and the South China Sea, and then the southwest, which is where India sort of would feature most prominently. Now, focusing here on this idea of the strategic direction does help us sort of put India into context. And it does so in the following way. In the 1950s and the 1960s, right, the main strategic direction for the PLA and its military strategy was the Northeast, because then the main scenario that military strategy was focused on in China was how to deter an invasion of China by the United States that China believed would occur on the Shandong Peninsula. As quaint as that might seem now today, that was certainly animating Chinese strategists in the 50s and 60s. Turning to the 70s and the 80s, roughly, the strategic direction shifted from the Northeast to the North to focus against the Soviet Union. Primarily, there were concerns about a ground invasion through Mongolia in an effort that China feared the Soviets might undertake to seize Beijing. And then with the end of the Cold War and the shift to local wars, basically the main strategic direction has focused on Taiwan, and then to an increasing extent sort of Taiwan and the United States based on the degree to which the US might become involved in the conflict over Taiwan. And this is often referred to as sort of the East or the Southeast, sort of depending in terms of sort of geography, but nevertheless highlights the fact that really since the end of the Cold War, kind of sort of the main objective of China's military strategy has been to focus on Taiwan. Which brings me sort of that review of sort of strategic directions brings me to my third point, which is that for China, right, India has never been its primary adversary in its military strategy, and the Southwest has never been a primary strategic direction. In other words, India really has never been sort of the core focus of China's military strategy, which has always been more concerned either with stronger adversaries such as the United States or the Soviet Union, or this critical issue of Taiwan. Instead, right, India has always been kind of a secondary adversary in the Southeast. the Southwest, excuse me, has always been what Chinese strategists describe as a secondary strategic direction. And so here, what this means is that China's main goal is on the one hand, is to sort of defend its claims in the sovereignty dispute, which, as Ajay mentioned, is humongous, right? It's 125,000 square kilometers, not including the territory adjacent involving Pakistan, but sort of the core areas on present sort of Indian and Chinese borders, right? Which makes it very large in size, roughly 4 times the size of Taiwan. But on the other hand, China does not want to become so focused on the Southwest and the border dispute with India that it sacrifices its ability to prepare to what it views as the more important contingencies in other strategic directions. And so in 1962, China did, of course, fight a war and start a war with India along the disputed frontier. But its main goal was primarily to negate what it viewed as Indian pressure, especially starting in early 1962 with the so-called forward policy, and to bring what it sort of stability to the border, which from its perspective would be the absence of Indian military pressure. The main reason was because at the time, right, China was actually very concerned about actions the United States might take, either adjacent, in the Northeast, or perhaps supporting Chiang Kai-shek in an effort to retake Taiwan. And so it was a short, violent, sharp war focused on destroying the forward Indian positions, but then the idea was this would sort of bring stability and allow China to focus the vast majority of its military forces in the primary strategic direction. And I would submit to you, right, this is basically what we are seeing again today. The United States certainly is becoming a more important concern from a military perspective for China. And I think it's probably on the cusp again of being perhaps identified as sort of China's main adversary. Certainly this is sort of revealed in how we now talk about strategic competition with China. And so it doesn't really want to spend a lot of effort and attention on its border with India, but nevertheless, there is this long-standing dispute there over which China, of course, does not want to sort of see its position being weakened unless there can be some sort of a negotiated settlement. And so there's this sort of paradox here whereby China is actually quite willing to take aggressive actions on the border with India, but the reason has to do actually with trying to bring about a degree of stability along that border defined as kind of negating Indian pressures so that China can focus more on what it views to be the more important strategic directions. So this brings me sort of to my fourth and final point, which is sort of why are we seeing this action now on the border between China and India, as Ajay so expertly laid out, especially focusing on the Western sector where China has made certain moves up to or across the line of actual control, especially as India sort of defines that line. And I would say here there are probably 4 points that sort of feed into this kind of active defense approach to military strategy, and this idea that China wants to sort of stabilize a secondary strategic direction so that it can in fact perhaps focus or ensure it's keeping focus on the primary strategic direction. When Xi Jinping came into office, right, he had a much more energized approach to and strident approach to Chinese sovereignty, which sort of incorporated the defense of it into sort of the so-called China Dream, and lines of not giving away 1 inch of the territory inherited from our ancestors and so forth. And so this was, sovereignty has always been important for China, but this is obviously was a sort of an elevation of the way in which it was being emphasized and stressed. Then you had the shadow of what happened between China and India over the Doklam area on sort of the Chinese, Bhutanese, Indian tri-junction, which I think really surprised China when India decided to move forces across the international boundary, at least between China and India in that area, to block China from building a road in an area that was sort of contested by China and Bhutan. I think China certainly didn't want to be surprised again going forward. Then you have sort of how China viewed the creation of Ladakh as a federally administered union territory, which was announced last summer as part of the bifurcation of the state of Jammu and Kashmir. And I think from China's point of view, this was certainly at least signaling greater Indian resolve to defend its claims to Ladakh, especially given some of the statements that the Home Minister Amit Shah made in the Indian Parliament as this was being discussed. And China issued public statements opposing it in August and October, but also has raised the issue several times in the United nations. And that, I think, created a frame by which China viewed the fourth factor, which was the infrastructure building that Ajay mentioned. Of course, in many areas, China's had an advantage in infrastructure, but also because it wants to maintain kind of stability defined as sort of the absence of Indian pressure on the border, it also is quite sensitive to improvements that India makes in its own infrastructure in the area. And of course, especially in the Western sector, where not only is there this main sort of important road that connects the two areas, but also perhaps a greater uncertainty over where the actual line of control lies, right? Because in the Eastern sector, more or less geography has created at least a line of actual control that in some senses is perhaps more stable. So this brings us to what happened in the spring. I think China viewed with concern the completion of what's known as the DS-DBO road that runs basically along most of the Western sector, quite close to the line of actual control, facilitating lateral movement of Indian forces, and then the building of feeder roads up to what India viewed as the line of control in these areas. And so in response, I think China moved forward in a way that really is kind of unprecedented in terms of sort of the scope, scale, and posture of Chinese forces, i.e. moving across the line of actual control in several areas at once with relatively large numbers. But again, within the frame of active defense, I think China might have viewed the combination of the creation of Ladakh as a Union territory, as well as India's own efforts to improve infrastructure and the greater activity of Indian forces along the line of actual control as a kind of threat to its position in the dispute that would have to be neutralized, and it would be neutralized by moving up basically into the territories where it has moved today. So that's how I would put kind of what's happening on the border today in sort of the broader context of China's military strategy. I'll now turn the camera and the mic over to Dennis Blasco, and just thanks again to Jamestown for having me here today.
Well, thanks for that wonderful background discussion. I think you hit a lot of really key points that we'll try to circle back to, Taylor, in the Q&A session. And for those participating online, we will be having a question and answer session, and we will be coming back to some of the speakers to ask some questions. We've had several people ask about if Ajay is going to speak again, and we can assure you he is coming back. But on that note, from the wonderful environment of Florida, I would like to turn the floor over to Colonel Blasco, and who will give us kind of an overview of the Western Military Theater, the current military situation, and share his perspectives. I would like to say to everyone that I've been profoundly impressed with how much Dennis has been following and how closely he's followed the situation in the Himalayas. I always thought that he was focused always on all these other wider pictures of China and Chinese military, but I'm very impressed by his detailed knowledge here. So Dennis, the floor is yours.
In general, I'd like to talk about the entire Western theater, the PLA Army deployments throughout the West. Unfortunately, with regard to the current standoff situation, the Chinese government has not provided any details about the units involved except to call them border troops. Therefore, my analysis of the situation of the borders, Sino-Indian border, is based on Indian news articles and a review of commercial imagery published by the media. The only images I've seen show the Galwan River Valley and Hot Spring, not Pangso Lake or the Depsang Plain. So I'm sure others could provide more detailed information. And as always, I'm open to new evidence that may change my analysis. For a general overview of the Western Theater, this is a Jamestown map with unit locations and identifications prior to the 2017 reorganization. This March, the Harvard Belford Center estimated that there are a total of 200,000 to 230,000 Chinese ground forces in the Western Theater, including the Tibet and Xinjiang military districts. These numbers would include both border defense units permanently stationed in the region and mobile operational units or combat units assigned mostly to group armies and also in Tibet and Xinjiang. Normally, the PLA patrols its periphery with border defense troops. In Xinjiang, these forces are organized mostly into regiments and battalions stationed in widely scattered barracks near the border that are not shown on the map. These units man remote outposts to observe activity, conduct foot or vehicle patrols, and use small drones. Routinely, patrols are performed by squads of about 8 men, sometimes platoons of about 40. In general, they are lightly armed with the mission to observe and report rather than fight. Command of the border forces opposite India is split between the Nanjiang or Southern Xinjiang Military District and the Tibet Military District. The Nanjiang MD commander probably oversees all border units in the Aksai Chin. And again, I've tried to highlight on this map the G219 to show you the importance of that road. Okay. The International Institute for Strategic Studies in London estimates there are approximately 16 border defense regiments amounting, my guess, to about 40,000 personnel in all of Xinjiang and Tibet to monitor roughly 3,000 miles of border. Although they might have been involved in taking the initial steps in the current dispute, it would be difficult for a border defense regiment to concentrate as much force at a single location as reported in the buildups at Galwan, Hot Spring, or Pangong So, and still be able to monitor its entire area of responsibility. Therefore, most of the large number of troops, vehicles, and structures seen in the disputed area are likely to be part of the mobile operational units assigned to Tibet or Xinjiang, not border forces. The commercial imagery that I've seen for Galwan and Hot Spring supports the presence of such combat forces. No group army headquarters are stationed in Tibet. Instead, the Tibet MD commands 3 combined arms brigades and at least 8 support brigades, plus logistics, warehouses, and depots. During the 2017 reforms, the 77th Group Army, located to the east, moved 3 combined arms into Tibet. So I estimate the number of units in Tibet roughly numbers around 50,000 personnel. Most of these are stationed roughly 800 to 1,000 miles from Galwan, and they routinely exercise at a training area about 50 miles northwest of Lhasa. The PLA media has reported on training at this area beginning in January this year and March, and then into June. The 77th Group Army also has another 3 combined arms brigades and 7 combat support brigades in Sichuan and Chongqing, some 800 miles east of Lhasa by road, amounting to another 35,000 personnel, roughly. An additional 50,000 troops of the 76th Group Army are located in Qinghai, Ningxia, and Gansu to the north, which is about a 1,000-mile train ride or road march to Lhasa. The Xinjiang MD commands 4 infantry divisions, plus at least 5 combat support brigades, and additional logistics units for a total of about 50 to 60,000 personnel in widely dispersed garrisons up to 1,000 miles from Galwan. The closest unit, about 400 miles by road from Galwan, is the 6th Mechanized Infantry Division, about 10,000 personnel in southern Xinjiang. Elements of one regiment from this division might have been deployed to Depsang, since it's the closest unit to that sector. For the entire theater, I estimate border defense, and mobile operational units number around 235,000 personnel, similar to Harvard's numbers. But only a small fraction of them are currently deployed near the Indian border, primarily because of the restrictive mountainous terrain and high altitude that limit the effectiveness and increase the vulnerability of large mechanized formations. This terrain favors the defense over mechanized attack confined to valley floors, especially if the defense is from fortified emplacements on the high ground. Based on the imagery that I've seen and the reporting out of India, I estimate that at the time of the 15th June incident, the PLA probably had assigned a brigade to each sector at Galwan, Hot Spring, and Pangong So, but the entire brigade may not have been deployed forward. In Galwan, based on imagery, I estimate 1 battalion forward, about 500 men, and then am guessing, because I haven't seen them, but probably 2 or 3 more battalions plus support forces further to the rear, adding another 1,000 or more personnel. The largest concentration of Chinese forces right now appears to be in the Pangong So area, but it's uncertain where all of these units came from. To me, they appear to be light mountain infantry, combined arms brigades, or maybe even a special operation brigade, but not border defense units. Ajay says that recently these numbers have increased by 30% since the 15th June confrontation, with troops now at Demchok and Chumar in the south, perhaps newly arrived units. He also speaks of increased activity in the western sector, which so far sounds to me like heightened manning levels and patrolling from outposts still controlled by border defense units. It's entirely possible that some of the units now at the border could have been diverted there after they conducted routine training elsewhere in the region. If they were in the field and then dispatched to the border, they would have had to drive to Galwan or Hot Spring, and that probably would have taken several days and required logistic support along the one route into the region from either the east or west. Any of the multiple units reported to be training through early June could have made this trek in time for the incident on the 15th. This is the Galwan sector, sometimes referred to as the Y Junction or Patrol Point 14. And the few images, the recent images of this area that I've seen support, but do not confirm the reporting in the Indian media that a new PLA unit had taken over 4 positions here prior to the clash. Reportedly, just before the fight, Colonel Santosh Babu tried to speak with what were described as new Chinese soldiers at an observation point near PP-14. But a PLA soldier pushed him, which resulted in the brawl. The best evidence I've seen to support a new force in the area comes from a 19 June Reuters article, which contained side-by-side images of the area before and after the conflict. On 9 June, a well-ordered camp was located about 3 kilometers from Patrol Point 14, consisting of squad tents, prefabricated multi-purpose vehicles, and about 10 trucks. But a week later, the day after the incident, nearly all the tents and shelters had been struck, and some 80 trucks and what appear to be Mengshi light assault vehicles, similar to US Humvees, filled the entire valley, with more vehicles and construction equipment closer to Patrol Point 14. One explanation for the difference in number of tents and vehicles could be the arrival of a new battalion-sized unit and the withdrawal of the old familiar, possibly border defense unit that previously had been there. Based on the information available to me, and I recognize that it's very limited, I estimate that elements of 4 or 5 combined arms brigades or special operation brigades, and perhaps a regiment from the Xinjiang military district could now be deployed to Galwan Hot Spring, Pangong Lake, Demchok and Chumar sectors, and also up to the Depsang, in the Depsang. Because of terrain limitations and logistics, each brigade probably has deployed forward only 2 or 3 reinforced battalions. In total, this would amount to some 5,000 to 9,000, perhaps 10,000 personnel in the valleys and mountains near the LAC, with logistics to the rear, and does not include any border defense units in the area. Barring a negotiated settlement, these recent PLA actions have redefined the LAC and likely will result in the construction of additional company and battalion-sized entrenched positions within the limit of what China considers to be its border claims. If the standoff persists over months or even years, the PLA could rotate battalions from roughly 3 dozen light combined arms and special operations brigades in the entire country into these outposts to conduct small unit operations to harden troops with no combat experience while honing officer and NCO leadership skills. Such a situation recalls to me the border clashes that followed the 1979 Sino-Vietnamese War that lasted until 1987. So thank you, Glenn. I look forward to the question and answer session.
Well, thank you, Dennis. We've had a lot of people asking questions, and we're going to get to you those questions. And I wanted to go back to Ajay and ask him a question about, we're getting a lot of questions online, people asking about what are the larger implications of this conflict. I mean, will the deployments that are going on, one panelist or one person in the audience has commented, said there's reports that Pakistan is moving troops into the region. And so what is the larger kind of picture here of this conflict with China escalating into something bigger? Ajay, and can you address what Dennis mentioned about in the Pangong So about this increase in deployments by the Chinese that led to the incident? Because it's my understanding that P-14 or PP-14 is something that's very controversial. And that's, as Dennis pointed out, prior to the clashes, there was a Chinese deployment there. I believe they established a base camp at PP-14, which is one of the fingers. They call the 8 fingers in the on the other side of the Galwan River. So, Ajay. your mic. Please unmute yourself. There you go.
Am I audible now?
Yeah, you're visible. Did you hear my question?
Yeah, I heard your question.
Okay.
Uh, so there are two vectors along which one has to see the incident and assess the incident. One is the Indian domestic political vector, and one is the vector of the India-Pakistan-China confrontation, the trilateral confrontation that takes place in Ladakh and in northern Jammu and Kashmir. On the Indian domestic political side, Indian actions are guided by the domestic imperative, the domestic political imperative for the government and for the Prime Minister to appear strong, in control, and mindful of India's national security needs, and unwilling to climb down before any opponent or any enemy. It is completely unacceptable in this domestic political sort of environment that I just laid out for China to be in possession of Indian territory and India doing nothing about it. So the sort of the way this went or played out was for the Indian government to, for a very long time, deny that anything was happening. There were no formal denials, but there were many unofficial denials put out through friendly media channels, put out through friendly analysts, put out through all kinds of people, that nothing really is happening and that China is only sort of doing its routine patrolling, and a patrol might have sat down in one place or the other, but they will leave soon. It was only much later when the sort of, it was perhaps too late already, that India actually deployed forces, sat down, blocked the Chinese, and sort of have stabilized the situation at a particular level, albeit one where Chinese troops are in possession of Indian territory. So that leaves India with the question and the conundrum about whether it is going to take military action to evict the Chinese, or it is going to take military action to take possession of Chinese territory in a sort of countervailing move, or it's sort of going to sort of effectively, and for all practical purposes, engage in armed hostilities with China. And that's where the second vector comes in, the China-Pakistan vector, because there is the question of when you engage in hostilities with China and Jammu and Kashmir, are you also opening the doors to a two-front war or two-front conflict where Pakistan also enters the fray? And that's where all these reports come in about Chinese troops being deployed to Pakistan, Pakistani troops mobilizing. There is no concrete evidence yet of any of that happening. So far, Pakistan is only in the most outrageous Indian media reports has Pakistan been reported as mobilizing, as Chinese aircraft sort of exercising from Pakistani bases and so on. From the government itself, there has not been any confirmation of any of this. From the Pakistani government, there has been an outright denial that any Chinese troops are in Pakistani soil connected with this particular incident. So, the conundrum is there before the Indian decision makers, what exactly they want to do. They thought that they might be able to resolve the situation through military-to-military dialogue, coupled with diplomatic dialogue between Beijing and Delhi. But the Chinese seem very firm on staying where they are. So right now, the ball is very much up in the air. The decision makers in India have a hard sort of job ahead of them.
What would the United States need to do, or how can the United States help India in this situation? Is one of our, we received an email request. Someone's asked about what can the U.S. do militarily to help India Is there a need for air defense? What would be the ways the United States could help India in this situation?
The United States has, to my understanding, at a very, very senior level, at the political level, already offered this India assistance thrice of any kind. And this offer has been followed up through diplomatic channels as well. On all three occasions, India has declined assistance. They have said that they are capable of handling the situation themselves. And that's where the matter stands right now. So I think the United States' role would be confined to providing intelligence support, providing sort of logistic backup in case it's needed, providing political and diplomatic backup in the United Nations and world bodies and so on. But in terms of actual physical support and armed support, whether in the air defense realm or in equipment realm or in fighter aircraft, I think India would be very wary of China seeing this as a confirmation of its worst fears, that India is falling into the United States' lap and is becoming part of an anti-China Western alliance. That's something that would concern and would worry not just people in Beijing, but decision makers in Delhi as well, because they don't want to create that impression. So I think that for now, the United States would best sort of tread softly on this issue, leave India's decision makers to sort of assess the situation and then make their own requests to Washington based on what the Indian assessment is.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Dr. Frauvel here and circle back to him on a question that we have about how China views this border area. Dr. Frauvel, you mentioned in your discussion that there's a series of pressure points that you view that China views India as a secondary adversary, not really a primary adversary, but it seems that the situation could quickly kind of blow up if it escalates any further. Do you have any thoughts on that, Dr. Frauvel?
Sure. I mean, at least if one looks at the statements coming out of Beijing after the clash, one gets a sense that China would like to return not necessarily to the status quo ante along the line of actual control, but certainly to the way in which China-India relations were before all of this happened. Lots of references to carrying out the joint statements of Xi and Modi and so on and so forth. And so that is consistent, I think, with an idea that China doesn't want to see the situation on the border with India kind of dominate its foreign and security policy, and that it would like perhaps to try to sort of have its cake and eat it too, i.e. to put the diplomatic and political genie back in the bottle while perhaps consolidating the gains that it's made. I think at the same time, right, China certainly will be very focused on what India may be considering doing in response, especially if China doesn't, at least in these three areas, sort of restore the status quo ante as India is demanding that it do. So it's still an unstable situation, but I don't see necessarily China wanting to sort of have this become sort of even more tense, more violent, more bloody in a way that would really crystallize international attention on China and sort of feed into some of the sort of dynamics around the formation of, even broader counterbalancing coalition that would certainly include India. And so, I think, as I said, China will try to have its cake and eat it too. We'll see if they can do that. But one does not get a sense that China necessarily yet is chomping at the bit for more. However, I am reminded of how the situation evolved along the China-India border in 1962. I don't want to sort of draw too many analogies. I think that those can be misplaced, but the main point here would be that you basically had a long, late spring and long summer of tensions, moves, counter moves that eventually led to a decision to fight in October. And so for that sense, like Dennis, I'm totally prepared to revise my analysis as the situation evolves. And we don't, we have a lot of runway left in terms of the so-called campaign season in the Himalayas, and there's a lot of uncertainty as to sort of what will happen. And of course, it's very dynamic in terms of how China and India are interacting with each other.
What is the common thread here, or is there any, between what's going on in Hong Kong, the cross-strait crisis with Taiwan, and then what we see here in the Himalayas? I mean, we certainly see Xi is certainly upping the game of sorts and playing a heavy hand. So is this kind of part of a larger strategy, you think, of him being tough along the periphery?
So I think it's part of a pattern of being tough along the periphery. I don't know if it's part of a strategy, right? In the sense that I think if one looks at Taiwan, the East China Sea, maybe not the East China Sea as much, the South China Sea and Hong Kong, certainly there were issues there that China viewed with grave concern. Now, we may not believe that China's concerns were warranted, but if we want to understand how Beijing sees the situation and does so really through a lens of sovereignty, then I think one can begin to make sense of why we're seeing China taking a hard line in multiple places at once, because it assesses that preventing losses on questions of sovereignty is critically important at a time when the country, when the leadership is under stress at home for the pandemic and for the economic aftershocks and facing growing international criticism abroad. And so I think there's a sense that Beijing can't sort of afford losses on other issues, especially ones as important as sovereignty. And so like Hong Kong, as terrible as the national security law appears to be, right, is a way in which that reflects a desire by China to maintain a grip over Hong Kong in light of the protests, which sort of continued unabated for the last year. With respect to Taiwan, again, from Beijing's standpoint, just sort of sharing how I think they see it, not necessarily my assessment of whether they see it correctly, but with the re-election of Tsai Ing-wen, there are greater concerns about Taiwan, and then with India in terms of what we've mentioned. So you could, if you're in Beijing, sort of view your periphery and your sovereignty concerns with greater alarm this spring, and sort of your concerns might be magnified by what's happening with respect to the pandemic at home and abroad, and that would sort of explain why you're doing sort of what you're doing. Sort of a lashing out, if you will, in multiple directions at once. The last thing I'll say, though, is, right, it also suggests, and this has been mentioned in a couple of sort of opinion pieces in the last day or two, and I sort of agree with this, right, that China has sort of, this sort of shows that China believes these things are really important to it, and it's willing to certainly tolerate greater friction with multiple neighbors at once. I mean, it would appear as if China's overreaching, that this will backfire because it's sort of going to give even more countries sort of a reason to view China with alarm. But nevertheless, given that this really does revolve from China's point of view about sovereignty, I think one can make sense, or one can at least see why they're doing it this way.
Thank you. I'm going to go back to Dennis here for a question. Dennis, you made the Western Military District a key part of your kind of your presentation, and I wanted to ask you about the role of General Zhao Zhongdi, that's been the commander of the Western Military Theater for quite some time. He was involved in the 2017 Doklam clashes with India, and you said something very interesting in your presentation about the fact that China's war with India is also, with General Zhao, he was also involved with the war with Vietnam, but you referred to it not just as a one-year war, but as part of a long series conflict with China and Vietnam on their border, that which was very interesting. Could you just kind of talk about how you see General Zhao's role in this theater, and what is he playing, or any at all? I think you indicated earlier that he was just kind of taking orders from Xi.
Yes, Zhao is obviously the Western Theater commander, and he sits between the CMC and the units that actually execute any operations orders. So it's very likely, and in fact, I'm sure that he and his staff consulted with the CMC and the operations department there about everything that's going on prior to the first movements of troops earlier this year. I find it inconceivable that he would have initiated this on his own without CMC approval. However, something like the clash on June 15th probably was not ordered by anybody, but it was a result of heightened tensions and low-level leaders and privates actually making decisions that have strategic effects. So Zhao is right in the chain of command, and he's been there since the theater was established almost 4 years ago, or 4 years ago now. So by virtue of that position, he would be in the middle of, and he would pass orders from the CMC down to his theater army commander. And actually, I think the more interesting question can be found in a South China Morning Post article from June 9th, about a week before the June 15th incident. And the South China Morning Post reported that Zhao's army commander in working for him, He Weidong, had swapped places with the theater commander, the theater army commander from the Eastern theater. And that seems like a very strange move to make in the middle of a crisis, changing your army commander who is directly in charge of those troops. So that's the question I try to look into the background. Why did that happen? And I've only seen the one report on it, but I just don't know. Maybe somebody was not happy with the way things were going, and rather than totally remove a commander, in a crisis situation, they shifted him out. So I just don't know. But also for Zhao, the theater commander, let me just mention, and as you say, he did fight in the Sino-Vietnamese War. I'm not sure whether he was part of the actual 1979 campaign or had been rotated into that front over the next 7 years or so. But after that period of time and after that combat experience, he basically stayed in the units opposite Vietnam for the majority of his career up until about 2012, when he was in command positions, moving all the way up the ladder until 2012, when he was reassigned out of region to the Jinan military region at the time to be the commander there. And after 4 years of command there, he was then sent to the new Western Theater because he had so much experience, both opposite Vietnam and also in Tibet.
Thank you. I am going to, we had a question from the audience, or we also have participating today, John Dotson, the editor of China Brief. I think he had a question he wanted to ask some of the speakers today, and we're going to go live to bring in John Dotson. So John, if you want to unmute yourself, we can ask the question. So John?
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, I wanted to thank the panelists. I found this very informative. China-India border issues was never something I looked at closely, so I found this very informative. The question I had, well, it may have been partially answered by some of the comments already, but I guess maybe I'll try to burrow down into it a little bit more. I wanted to ask the panelists their sense as to whether or not these recent incidents are, if we can ascribe them more to proximate issues, like Mr. Shukla, for example, was mentioning how Chinese troops along the line of control have responded at times in the past to Indian infrastructure construction, and that perhaps they may have adopted a more aggressive posture due to that. But I wanted to ask them their sense as to whether or not these clashes should we chalk them more up to proximate issues, or should we look at them more as being part of a larger pattern of a more aggressive posture being taken by the PRC, not just along the Indian border regions, but also, for example, with more aggressive aviation flights around Taiwan that we've seen in the early months of this year and so forth. So just kind of want to get your general thoughts on that.
Thank you, John. That's a great question. I'll throw this at anybody in the among the speakers to answer. And the question you asked was really interesting because we have Michael Swain is watching the show today in the program, and he had the exact same question. And his question was kind of directed at Taylor, that with all this pressure kind of pouring down on China is from all these directions with COVID, the U.S. sanctions. I mean, the escalations and the increase in military posture, the kind of confrontations going on in South China Sea. I mean, is there something here that's kind of also pressuring China from internationally that's kind of probing on this? And so I just wanted to piggyback on John's question to Taylor. But please, anybody else wants to weigh in with John Dotson's question to kind of what's kind of causing this right now? I mean, what is there something on the Chinese side that's kind of motivating this?
Shall I weigh in first?
Yes, go right ahead, Ajay.
Okay. To me, there's the coming together of multiple dimensions of motives, all pointing in the same direction. At the strategic level, you have China concerned about India getting too close to the United States, about aligning itself more openly with the Quad, about the militarization of the Quad, about recent naval exercises with Australia. At the economic level, you have the recent ban on Chinese companies sending foreign direct investment across the border to India. You have the growing sort of inclination of India not to allow Chinese 5G companies to participate in the 5G rollout in India. Then at the regional level, you had India's action in Kashmir in August 5th, where China and Pakistan both found themselves for the first time with their interests very strongly and directly aligned in Kashmir, with the Indian Home Minister saying and announcing in Parliament that we will take back our territory from Pakistan and the Aksai Chin as well. So you had that provocation as well. You have India's sort of very, I would say, meek geopolitical and diplomatic behavior, where it has refrained from criticizing China on numerous issues, on Taiwan, on Hong Kong, on the South China Sea provocations. Then you have India's behavior pattern at Doklam, where the remilitarization of Doklam by China was not strongly objected to by India. So for China, everything is pointing towards taking some action against India. When she in the Central Military Commission talks to Zhao about something like this, Zhao immediately sees tactical benefits in it. A position of a better line of control for India, interdiction of, purely tactical issues like interdiction of the new communications network created by India. So for me, there isn't one or the other. There's just a coming together of a large number of issues to China, and China then deciding to make this move, which I think, by the way, is a strategic blunder.
Thank you. Taylor, do you want to try to take a jab at that?
Sure. I mean, I think some of it dovetails with what I already said, namely that, right, China has viewed a lot of challenges from its standpoint on sovereignty issues and is quite willing to react. Now, one issue might be what is, in addition to everything that Ajay mentioned, U.S.-China relations really have deteriorated quite significantly since the outbreak of the pandemic, and the pandemic has contributed to that. And I think perhaps it also might be the case that China is less worried about trying to prevent any further worsening of U.S.-China relations because it's happening already, and therefore it's more willing to sort of assert itself aggressively in these different sovereignty questions, whether it's Taiwan, India, what have you, because it's no longer really constrained by a desire to maintain a better relationship with the United States. And so that would just be an additional strategic factor. But I mean, certainly the political scientist in me would love to find one prime cause of all of this. And that's, of course, I think impossible. So I very much agree with what Ajay said in terms of there being many different things kind of coming together that have sort of made this possible. And I think one could see them in Taiwan and Hong Kong and elsewhere as well.
Thank you.
And could I add?
Yeah, sure, Dennis.
This actually fits into the whole concept of active defense. Everything at the political level that Ajay described probably convinced Beijing that things were going bad, or things could go bad in the near future. And Beijing, according to active defense, which will only strike after China has been struck, would rationalize this by saying that the Indian side has already taken the strategic initiative and crossed a line, even though they haven't, and many of them are political, but they haven't physically crossed the line into China, but they have showed the intention that they very well could. Therefore, China at the operational and tactical level could take action and with the intent to deter India from taking even further aggressive actions from Chinese perspective. This, of course, gets into the whole chicken and egg debate of what came first. But the Chinese actually can justify this according to their military doctrine.
You know, I think that's that's a really good point, and I think that as I've heard this discussion today, we had a question come in from Jonathan Pollock, who was asking a question about what is the senior U.S. policy response to this, and rightfully so. I mean, here you have the United States coining the whole idea of a free and open Indo-Pacific, but yet we're kind of not really seen on this, and I think we're and I have asked senior level U.S. officials in the Department of Defense about the idea of the Indo part of the Pacific, and whether the Himalayas were kind of factored into that, and I got a blank stare back. So I don't think that the U.S. quite has been thinking about this. I'm going to go back here to Ajay. We had a question from someone who was asking an Indian viewer who was asking about where's Russia in all this? Is Russia going to suddenly start deploying S-400s in the Himalayas to protect India? Or, I mean, can you bring in kind of the Russian side of this? And then when you're finished with that, talk about this question about the weather and the acclimatization problems of fighting in the Himalayas. We wanted to ask you that question, and I promised you I would allow you some time to address that, and especially its impact on equipment. So Russia, and then the high altitude factor in warfare.
Okay, for Russia, this is it's a real win-win. It's always been, it's shared China's concern about India falling too deep into the American camp, about India buying an increasing amount of arms and weapons from the United States rather than from Russia, its traditional supplier. And it's of course been on the China, Russia, the United States triangle. It's been firmly on the side of China, which also is a serious buyer of Russian equipment, even though it's now starting to build so much of its own equipment. So Russia is very much hands-off on this. It has, to the extent that the statements have come out of Moscow, they have been along the lines of this is something that India and China need to handle and resolve themselves. So Russia is not going to sort of get involved in any serious way unless the situation really spirals out of control and sort of regional security is affected seriously. Russia, for now, I think would be hands off and sort of watching the fun, if I may put it that way. Coming to the issue of operating at high altitudes. Now that's something that the Indian Army has really developed a significant degree of expertise in over the years, as has Pakistan and the Chinese military to a lesser degree. The Chinese military has operated for significant periods in the Tibetan plateau, but then they rotate their units through there, and there isn't this sustained sort of presence in high altitude that the Indian Army has sort of experienced over the years. So there are two key elements to this thing, and that is the degradation of performance of personnel and the degradation of performance of equipment. And you, as an army who's operating in that area, you have to constantly balance between these two, and you have to make sure that they do not impair operational effectiveness in any significant way. As soon as you cross 10,000 feet altitude, your performance as a sort of functional human being, both in the mental realm, in the physical realm, in the psychological realm, starts to degrade. And that's the reason why all sort of Indian troops being inducted into higher altitudes undergo a first stage of acclimatization in acclimatization camps that are sort of located along the way to their forward higher localities. For 6 days, they acclimatize at 9,000 or 10,000 feet. In the case of Ladakh, the acclimatization is done at Leh. And then after 6 days there, they then move to a second level of acclimatization at 14,000 feet, where they spend 4 days. And then from there, they go on to higher altitudes and so on, depending on where they are required to be deployed. If you are inducted into a combat environment without these levels of acclimatization, you will undergo the same problems that the Indians underwent in 1962 when they were sort of on the Namkachu rivulet, facing fully acclimatized Chinese troops, and the Indians were just sort of thrown in straight from the plains of Assam. So this is something which it's not a mistake that the Indian military is going to ever make again. The experiences like deploying in Kargil and in Siachen, where there are posts of over 20,000 feet high altitude, has developed this expertise, and the personal dimensions of it, both in terms of high altitude medicine, in terms of procedures, in terms of battle drills and so on, are very well honed on the Indian side. As, and I will again say, probably the case in Pakistan and China as well. For equipment, it's a different ball game altogether. Armor that has been inducted into Ladakh, for example, from the Indian side, had to develop their own whole set of protocols about how to operate in those extreme cold climates and high altitudes. The equipment is Russian, so it's not new to cold weather, but altitude it is absolutely new to. So there are a whole new set of procedures and so on that have been evolved in sort of making them battle worthy and ready to take the field at short notice. As for aircraft, now that's a serious problem that the Chinese face, because operating from the 4,000 meter high altitudes in Tibet, those airfields, there is a 30 to 40% weight penalty that those aircraft pay when they're taking off in that thin air on sort of airfields that are limited in length and so on. So, to that extent, the Indian Air Force can look forward to an advantageous situation vis-a-vis the Chinese Air Force, because those aircraft, the procedures that they would adopt would probably involve taking off with a sort of a higher weapons load, but with a very low fuel load, and then refueling midair before going on for your mission, so as to be able to sort of maximize the ordnance that you carry. But there are limitations to these kind of strategies, and the Chinese Air Force will find itself operating with lower fuel loads and lower munitions loads compared to the Indian aircraft, which will operate from airfields in the plains. So to that extent, it's a mixed bag. Also, it has to be said that when the Indian Air Force is operating in temperatures of 45 degrees, as is the case now, their weapons loads are also impacted, though not to the degree that altitude impacts weapons load on aircraft. So at least as far as aircraft are concerned and Air Force and air battles are concerned, the Indian Air Force will have a slight edge on that count.
And what about drone usage? Does China been using any drones at all in that area?
They have been using drones. The Indian side has been using hail drones as well. But you're in a very contested environment as far as air is concerned. There is a lot of air defense on both sides. If you're using drones, it's not like using drones in Iraq or Afghanistan where there's no air defense. So they are used with caution. They are used selectively, but both sides are using drones. But yes, as you mentioned, performance is impacted, endurance is impacted, and the altitude, when you're at 30,000 feet above sea level, that's very different from being 30,000 feet above an 18,000 foot peak or an 80,000 foot environment. So there are limitations that come into drone operations as well.
Ajay, what is going to happen with PP-14? We have a question from someone that said, will China or will India allow China to keep that forward base that it had created, that base camp that led to the fighting on June 15th? Will they allow China to keep that base camp area? Will they try to retaliate and push them back? What do you foresee happening in that area of tension?
Well, it's politically difficult. It's politically hazardous for any Indian leadership to allow China to keep any Indian territory or territory that's perceived as Indian territory on the Indian side. There are arguments to be made, and some of those arguments we are already beginning to see. That this is contested territory, it's not really Indian territory. Apologists for the government are beginning to put out these arguments. But there is a strong sort of nationalistic wave in India as well that would sort of not allow the government or discourage the government from accepting any Chinese sort of occupation and occupation on a sustained basis of territory that India has patrolled and India has been realistically claiming possession of. And that in the case of Galwan or parts of Galwan, even China has not staked claims to before. So there are sort of political hazards, that there are political drivers that will drive India to a hardline stance. You're already seeing the Indian military mobilizing in a very big way. Whether they'll actively attack PP-14 and the Chinese camps there, whether they'll go into another area and sort of do a countervailing occupation of Chinese territory, that we'll have to see how they actually play it out. But to just sit and accept Chinese occupation of Indian territory is fraught with political hazard.
Thank you. I would agree, and I think that when you look at the whole Karakoram range, this is issue that there's a lot of pressure points where China can apply all this, and we could see a conflict reemerge in any one of these areas, and there's a larger strategic issue. We are nearing the end of our presentation discussion today, and I would like to, before we close, to give each person each panelist a kind of closing comments, observations you want to make, and before we end our discussion today. And since Ajay just spoke, I'm going to turn to you, Taylor, if you have a few parting comments, observations, thoughts, and then we'll go to Dennis, and then come back finally.
Sure, thanks, Glenn. That's been a really terrific discussion. I've learned a lot. I would just say, I think India has some really hard choices ahead, and none of them are necessarily very attractive. If it wants to restore the status quo ante as it existed as of roughly mid-April in these areas, I think it will be hard for, not impossible, but just hard for India to find the leverage it needs to persuade China to move back and to do so without further fighting. Thanks.
Dennis.
Thank you, Glenn.
You're on.
Okay. I'd just like to speak just a little bit about the terrain and the limitations of the terrain, in addition to all the altitude and mountains or altitude problems that Ajay spoke with. The terrain is real in most of this area is really bad for mechanized formations. And basically they cannot move or maneuver laterally. Moreover, they can't support each other from horizontally side to side. So these units are backed up down valleys for miles and miles and miles, which is one of the reasons why my numbers may be a little bit smaller than some of the others that you see, because I just don't think they want to pack too many troops and vehicles into such bad terrain, because they just make lucrative targets if the fighting actually starts. Lucrative to either air, missile, or artillery attack. This really, if it goes forward in a prolonged conflict, this is light infantry terrain where people will be trying to gain control of the ridges and hilltops and long-range areas for long-range observation. In most of the areas, the new tanks and APCs and everything else will really be constricted. This will be, this is a very, very tough place to operate, even when you have air support and artillery support. And I think one of the reasons that the 77th Group Army shifted some of its units up onto the Tibetan plateau is so that they could become more acclimatized and oriented to the terrain in case they ever were needed to go forward. And thank you very much.
That's a great point. I think it's something that really keep in mind, especially as Army units get backed up into valleys and trying to maneuver. And maneuvering in Himalayas to begin with is a challenge. Ajay, we're going to give you the last word here today.
Well, I'll just say, and I'll leave you with the thought that India finds itself in the worst case fighting a two-front war against China and Pakistan, two formidable sort of foes. And in the best case, managing a sort of a very aggressive and a very sort of, what should I say, an impasse with China on this sort of particular issue. And it does so at a time when defense spending is at historic lows. It's a complete repeat of 1962, when India found itself facing a war with China at a point when defense spending had been slashed to completely sort of levels that were unprecedented at that time. Today, it finds itself in the same position as well. So there's a lesson here for Indian policymakers, you know, that defense spending is sort of, it's not something that appeals to the Ministry of Finance at a time when development expenditure is taking priority. But it's an expense that has to be incurred so that you are ready for a situation or a crisis when it occurs. And I'm sure that India's policymakers are taking note of this. Today, there was a expenditure cleared of 40,000 crores. That would be $3.5 billion worth of weaponry. And, you know, it's like trying to throw money at the problem when it's too late. That money will, by the time that equipment comes into service, it'll probably be too late for it to be used carefully. So there are implications for long-term planning here and long-term financing of defense that I hope Indian policymakers will take note of. Thank you, Glenn.
Thank you. I just want to ask you to clarify one thing. I had heard that Modi government had spent a lot of money in the last couple of years on road development and improving the regional infrastructure for mobility in the Himalayas. Is that not correct? Have they not?
I would sort of modify that statement to a certain extent. The projects have come on stream in the last 2 years, but they've been initiated more than a decade ago. So it takes a very long time to build a road or to put through connectivity to a point that's, you know, across 2 mountain ranges or 3 mountain ranges. But that's happened over the last couple of years. This DBDSO road that is so in the limelight as a consequence of this crisis is one example. It began being constructed in 2004. So, you know, the first NDA government actually kicked off that project. So it's good that it's coming on stream, but all these things take a very long time.
Thank you. Well, listen, thank you everyone for appearing today. For those watching us, we thank you for your participation and watching the video. We will be posting this to YouTube, our Jamestown YouTube channel after this. So thank you everyone, and we'll give you the virtual hand and say thank you everyone for participating. So Ajay, Dennis, and Taylor, thanks for joining us, and we hope to see you again. Thank you very much. Have a good day, everyone, and good evening, and good night.
Thanks,
Good night.
bud.